Let me now say a few words in English, which probably is slightly more understandable than my Cantonese. I understand yesterday at the Workers' Party rally, Mr. Pritam Singh had said Halima Yaakob and myself could be the next Prime Ministers of Singapore in the First World Parliament. I just wanted to thank Mr. Singh and the Workers' Party for the sentiment, but I also thought it was actually useful to examine exactly what he said, because the Workers' Party's manifesto is based on towards a First World Parliament, and it's always important to examine carefully what the opposition says. This is his rationale for saying that Halima would be a Prime Minister or a First World Parliamentarian. These are Mr. Pritam Singh's words. He said the PAP has a very capable female MP by the name of Halima Yaakob, who for the last 5 years has asked many questions in Parliament on labour-related issues and issues that affect ordinary working-class Singaporeans. He said, in his mind, anyone who asks questions about the well-being of ordinary Singaporeans is a first-world parliamentarian. I understand that sentiment. I just wanted to point out that Halima, as Mr. Singh acknowledged, did this the last 5 years before the Workers' Party manifesto was written. Therefore, by that measure, we have already a First World Parliamentarian with the potential to be Prime Minister even before the Workers' Party came out with its manifesto. Not only that, every PAP MP in the last Parliament has asked questions about the well-being of ordinary Singaporeans because they were concerned about the well-being of ordinary Singaporeans. So again, by that measure, the last Parliament was a first-class or a world-class Parliament. This is not my measure. This is Mr. Pritam Singh's measure, and he's probably right. Then he said, in respect to me, and I do appreciate the sentiment, because he talked about what I said in an article in the Straits Times about having better explanation and early engagement, and he quoted me. So I'm going to quote him quoting me, then I'm going to quote him. Ms. Rajah said, and I quote, "Just like the integration of foreigners, we need explanation, dialogue, and communication." I unquote. Now, explanation, dialogue, and communication are key characteristics of Workers' Party's First World Parliament. So yes, I think Indranee Rajah can also be a potential Prime Minister of Singapore. Now, his rationale was because I talked about the need for explanation, dialogue, and communication, which I do think is important, and I'm glad he thinks so too. But I just wanted to point out that explanation, dialogue, and communication is something all the PAP MPs of the last Parliament did as part of their work as MPs, part of their work as advisors. So by that same measure, the last Parliament was already a First World Parliament. And long before the Workers' Party came out with its manifesto. He also said, but if the Prime Minister is a man, he would want him to complete his national service. So we have 3 characteristics that Mr. Singh has identified for a prime minister in the First World Parliament. I mean, by the measure that he has set out, we would already have a lot, but the three is people who ask about the well-being of ordinary Singaporeans, persons who explain, dialogue and communicate, and if a man, he must complete his national service. We already have such a person, our own Prime Minister, who not only did national service, but was a regular in the SAF and a Brigadier General in the artillery. And so, I wouldn't presume to be a Prime Minister in the Parliament because we already have a very good one who meets all the criterion laid down by Mr. Singh and more. And this PM is putting together his new team for the next 5 years. And he needs your mandate, your endorsement and support for his team because this government is a caring government. Let me explain why I say that, because sometimes it's counterintuitive when you look at some of the policies and you think, oh, how does this show government cares? But let me just take 2 examples. One is the jobs credit during the 2008 financial crisis. Every other country in the world was thinking in terms of giving out subsidies or giving out handouts. Our government thinks out of the box. What it did was, so in the other countries, they're giving handouts or subsidies to those who are unemployed. What our government did was it gave jobs credits to employers to encourage employers to keep Singaporeans employed. And that is a completely unique and different strategy, not employed anywhere else. Firstly, because our government thinks out of the box. But secondly, you must ask yourself, why did our government do this? Because it cared about Singaporeans. It cared about Singaporeans' jobs, and it wanted to make sure that Singaporeans stayed employed in a situation where we had a grave financial crisis. Second example, minimum wage. Minimum wage is something intuitively you think, oh, it's good to have a minimum wage. But actually, minimum wage encourages unemployment. And let me just explain why. Let's say you have somebody who employs 2 or 3 assistants. He pays them each $750. If you impose a minimum wage on him, and let's say you insist that he must pay all 3 of them $1,500 each, and if his business cannot support that kind of cost, what will he do? He's very likely to say, okay, in that case, I keep 2 and I terminate the employment of 1, or I keep 1 and I terminate the employment of 2. Then 1 or 2 people have to lose their jobs because you set a minimum wage. And our government understands this. And in order to get around that problem, it came up with the idea of workfare. And what workfare does is this. It allows the employer to continue employing, using that example, 750. But the government is the one that tops up. So the employee gets more, but the employer doesn't have to pay more, and the employee stays employed. And that, again, is how we think out of the box. And why do we do that? Because the government cares. It cares about the employment of Singaporeans, and it doesn't want to see a Singaporean lose his or her job. And that is why we have workfare and not a minimum wage, because the minimum wage would lead ultimately to job losses. So these are just 2 examples to tell you that this government cares about Singaporeans, cares about ordinary working people, and is committed to make sure that Singapore prospers for the future. And to do that, PM is putting together his team, and Sam is an important member of that team. Psyche just told you about Sam's speeches in Parliament. Let me just touch on some of the topics that Sam has spoken about, because I want you all to know what Sam is like in Parliament, the things he speaks about, all of which show care and concern, not just for his Radin Mas residents, although many of them are drawn from examples of his Radin Mas residents, but also care and concern for Singaporeans as a whole. This is some of the things he's spoken about. First, regulation of health supplements and healthcare devices, because he was concerned about consumers, especially the elderly, spending money on these things. In his budget speech, he talked about measures to prevent profiteering and raising of prices, because he was concerned about the affordability for residents on the ground. He's also spoken about protection of the environment, recycling, tax rebates for environmentally friendly companies, preservation of the trees, first because he's concerned about the environment, but also because of the living environment for his residents. He's talked about the pay-as-you-use, and he's asked the government to address the root cause of the utilities arrears. In other words, don't just think that PAYU is the solution, but look deeper to see what is the reason why residents have arrears. That's Sam for you, looking at the root cause of the problem to see how it can be fixed. He's talked about the restructured hospitals and how it's important to spend on the essentials for medical services and not on non-essential things. He also wanted the Ministry of Health to review healthcare services to see that it was up to the industry benchmark. Why? To make sure that the healthcare services for Singaporeans are up to standard. And he was also very concerned about the regulation of health maintenance organizations. He asked the minister to re-examine, Minister for MCYS, to re-examine the eligibility criteria under the HOPE scheme, because he wanted more people in the target group to be helped. On the National Registry of Diseases, he talked about the need for privacy to safeguard medical information belonging to patients. He talked about skin donation for burn victims. All these things, the many topics he's talked about, show just one thing. Sam cares. He cares about his residents, he cares about Singaporeans, and he's a member of a team that cares about Singaporeans as well. So I would urge all of you, please give Sam your vote, because he will take care of Radin Mas, and he is the best candidate that we can have for Radin Mas. Vote for Sam and the PAP. Thank you.
Thank you.